Let us pray. Almighty God, we willingly acknowledge you as a supreme being, most gracious and most merciful. Look down, we beseech you, on us who are members of this Senate, and deign to assist us in the duties that we have to perform on behalf of our beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago. Open our eyes to see the truth and help us to accept it with all its implications into our lives. Direct us, O Lord, in our deliberations, so that setting aside private interests, unwholesome prejudices, and personal affections, we may treat all matters set before us with honesty, courage, and conviction. Through all we say and do in this Senate, may we give glory and honor to your holy name, inspire confidence in our fellow citizens, and make a positive contribution to the peace and prosperity of our nation. Amen.
Announcement by the President.
Honorable Senators, I have granted leave of absence to Senator Sophia Choate, SC, who is ill. Honorable Senators, I have received the following correspondence from Her Excellency the President, Paula May Weeks. The Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago by Her Excellency Paula May Weeks, President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, to Mr. Ronald Gahiris Duke. Whereas by instrument dated 14th of May 2018, I appointed you to act as a temporary senator with effect from the 15th of May 2018 and continuing during the absence from Trinidad and Tobago of Senator Jennifer Raffoul. In exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44 of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, I, Paula May Weeks, President as aforesaid, do hereby revoke with immediate effect your appointment to act as a temporary senator, given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President St. Anne's this 21st day of May 2018. To Pastor Clive Dottin. Whereas Senator Jennifer Raffoul is incapable of performing her duties as a senator by reason of her absence from Trinidad and Tobago, now therefore I, Paula May Weeks, President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(a) and Section 44(4)(c) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Pastor Clive Dottin, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 21st of May 2018 and continuing during the absence from Trinidad and Tobago of the said Senator Jennifer Raffoul, given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President St. Anne's this 21st day of May 2018. To Mr. John Heath. Whereas Senator Sophia Choate, SC, is incapable of performing her duties as a senator by reason of illness, I, Paula May Weeks, President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(b) and Section 44(4)(c) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, John Heath, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 21st of May 2018 and continuing during the absence of Senator Sophia Choate, SC, by reason of illness, given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President St. Anne's this 21st day of May 2018. Honorable Senators are required to take the oath.
I, Clive Dottin, having been appointed a member of Parliament, do affirm by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
I, John Heath, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, upon which I am about to enter.
Honourable Senators, permit me to welcome the students of the Madras Government Primary School. They are here with us.
Questions on notice? Urgent questions.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam. To the Honourable Prime Minister, in light of the passing of 6-year-old Zakia Lord after she succumbed to her injuries, can the Prime Minister state whether an investigation will be undertaken?
Minister in the Office of the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me first extend sincere condolences to the family, friends, and loved ones of young Zakia. The matter is currently being investigated by the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. Thank you, Madam President.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, can the Minister indicate whether the Tobago House of Assembly intends to conduct an inquiry into this matter as well?
Minister.
Thank you, Madam President. Since the incident occurred, the Tobago House of Assembly would have been investigating and looking into their safety procedures and protocols. Thank you.
Next question, Senator Mark.
To the Honourable Minister of National Security. In light of recent reports that there is an escalation in the number of allegations of domestic violence by police officers, can the Minister advise what urgent measures are being implemented to reduce this incidence of domestic violence?
Minister of National Security.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, with regards to the statement of an escalation in the number of allegations of domestic violence by police officers, I'm awaiting validation of this from the Commissioner of Police. The Trinidad and Tobago Police Service has adopted a zero-tolerance approach to every report of domestic violence committed by police officers. Each matter is treated with the greatest level of urgency to ensure that the matter is thoroughly investigated and that appropriate action is taken against the perpetrators. Support, Madam President, is also provided to the victim through the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service Victim and Witness Support Unit. Additionally, Officers receive training to deal with domestic violence situations, and over 250 officers have been trained in peer counseling as an internal support mechanism, Madam President.
Senator Mark.
Could the Honourable Minister indicate, given the urgency of this matter, when the report of the Commissioner of Police can be expected to be submitted to your good self?
Minister.
Madam President, I don't have a timeline. The Commissioner of Police is investigating it, and he will respond accordingly.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, can I ask the Honourable Minister whether there are any mechanisms in place to monitor this phenomena, given the stressful nature of the occupation of the police officer?
Minister.
Madam President, the Commissioner of Police is treating with the matter, and I'm sure he's treating it with quite a degree of urgency, and will report accordingly.
Next question, Senator Mark.
To the Honourable Minister of Education. Can the Minister advise of the total number of persons who are expected to be retrenched in the upcoming weeks as part of the UTT's restructuring exercise?
Minister of Education.
Thank you very much. According to the information received from the University of Trinidad and Tobago, 59 academic staff are to be dismissed, 57 of which have already received dismissal letters. In addition, 287 non-academic staff are expected to be dismissed. Discussions are still ongoing between the OWTU and the University of Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you very much.
Senator Mark.
Yes. Can the Minister indicate, based on requests for information by the sitting union, read the retrenchment of some 287 non-academic staff members? Can the Honourable Minister indicate to this Senate whether the UTT has provided the counter information required or the information requested by the sitting union?
Minister.
Madam President, as part of the negotiating process, the union has been requesting certain information, certain bits of information that has been provided to the union. However, I have facilitated 3 meetings in an effort to bring both parties together. And at the last meeting that I held with the union and UTT, the union had requested some additional bits of information. The UTT is now treating with that information, and I've been assured that in the not-too-distant future, that information will be relayed to the union. Thank you very much.
Madam President, through you, can I ask the Honourable Minister, with close to 300 academic and non-academic staff being earmarked for retrenchment, can you share with the Senate what impact, if any, this layoff will have on the quality of education at the level of UTT? Madam President.
Senator Mark, that question does not arise. Next question, Senator Mark.
To the Honourable Minister of Labour and Small Enterprise Development. Can the Minister advise whether the Ministry has been formally notified by the UTT of its retrenchment of several employees, and what assistance, if any, is being provided by the Ministry to the retrenched employees?
Minister of Labour and Small Enterprise Development.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, I am informed by the University of Trinidad and Tobago that with regards to the academic staff, they are not deemed to be workers under the Act which require reporting to the Minister of Labour.
Senator Mark?
Madam President, they are citizens of the Republic, of course. What I would ask the Honourable Minister, even though they are not workers, as deemed by the Industrial Relations Act, given what you have said, what assistance, if any, is the ministry prepared to offer to those retrenched academic members of the community?
Minister?
Madam President, through you, I'd just like to remind my colleague that the Ministry of Labour, we do have in place a program that is called, that emerged from the 10-point plan, one of which the National Employment Service, that unit falls under the Ministry of Labour, where employers register with us and unemployed or retrenched persons are invited to register with the Ministry of Labour. As a matter of fact, we have opened a National Retrenchment Register to capture more accurately the number of persons retrenched in Trinidad and Tobago, because the Act states that an employer is only required to inform the Minister of Labour of retrenchment if that employer is retrenching 5 or more workers, and therefore under 5, there's no requirement. So that we invite those who have been retrenched to visit the offices of the Ministry of Labour, and they will be given the necessary assistance and guidance where possible.
Honourable Senators, the time for urgent questions has expired. Honourable Senators, permit me to invite you to join with me in acknowledging our very distinguished guest with us in the chamber, Senator the Honourable Janine Michelle Girodi McIntyre. She is the President of the Senate of the Parliament of St. Lucia. The President of the Senate of St. Lucia is visiting with us and will be participating in the 10th gathering of the Parliamentary Network for Gender Equality, which is taking place this week.
Questions on notice? Questions for oral answer?
Yes. Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, the government would like to have a deferral of all 4 questions listed on the order of people today, 131, 132, and 133 for 2 weeks.
Questions 131, 132, and 133 are deferred for 2 weeks.
Get an explanation from the Honourable Leader as to why these questions are being deferred?
Well, Senator Mark, I will... It's not normally at the beginning of the this part of the order paper, the minister indicates what questions he'll be answering. Okay?
Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on definite matters of urgent public importance.
Senator Haynes.
Thank you, Madam President. I hereby seek your leave to move the adjournment of the Senate today under Standing Order 16 to discuss an urgent matter of definite importance, namely the crime epidemic currently gripping Trinidad and Tobago. The matter is definite as it pertains specifically to the crime wave that has gripped Trinidad and Tobago in the past few weeks, where there has been an increase in home invasions and violent crimes. The matter is urgent as Trinidad and Tobago is under threat of becoming a failed state under this administration, and the government has failed in its duty to protect the people of Trinidad and Tobago by guaranteeing their safety. The matter is of public importance because as it stands, no one in Trinidad and Tobago feels safe and no one is safe. Thank you.
Honourable Senators, I have considered the motion of the Senator and I am not satisfied that the matter as presented qualifies under this standing order.
Public business, private members' business.
Senator Mark.
Thank you very much. Madam President, I beg to move the following motion standing in my name. Whereas it is established by Section 71(1) and 12 of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, that there shall be an Elections and Boundaries Commission that in the exercise of its functions shall not be subject to the direction or control of any person or authority. And whereas the Elections and Boundaries Commission is responsible for holding free and fair elections throughout Trinidad and Tobago, be it resolved that the Senate take note that the Elections and Boundaries Commission is not subject to any parliamentary scrutiny or accountability in respect of its activities and operations, unlike other similar independent bodies such as service commissions. And be it further resolved that the Senate call on the government to take urgent steps to introduce legislation that would make the Elections and Boundaries Commission accountable to the citizenry of Trinidad and Tobago by allowing parliamentary scrutiny of its administration, the manner of the exercise of its power or powers, methods of functioning, and any criteria adopted by the Commission in the exercise of its powers and functions. Madam President, there should be no sacred cows in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and particularly where public resources are being expended to execute their operations and other actions. Madam President, I want to refer to the Constitution, first of the United National Congress, and later on to the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. And under Section 2, Aims and Objectives, dealing with what I call Roman or Article 7, it states, and I quote, "The United National Congress is committed to the following aims and objects: to struggle against any tendency towards authoritarianism, autocracy, and dictatorship, and to promote a viable diffusion of centers of power and decision-making as a check against the concentration and abuse of power." Madam President, the Republican Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago, Part 4, from Section 70, 71, 72, and 72, outlines in brief the responsibilities, functions, and duties of the Elections and Boundaries Commission. And one of the matters, Madam President, you will observe in this part of the Constitution, and particularly Section 72, sub 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, is a provision that says that once a report is tabled or submitted by the Commission to the Parliament, that report, Madam President, can either be accepted, approved, or rejected. There is no wriggle space for the people or the people's representatives to conduct any modification, any amendments to the recommendations of the Elections and Boundaries Commission. It is either these recommendations are rejected, they are approved, and that's the end of the matter. I will show you, Madam President, in my contribution, that the framers and fathers of this Constitution back then may have had their reasons for doing so. But the dynamics of development and the need for greater accountability and transparency over the years have forced many countries within the Commonwealth, including New Zealand, South Africa, the United Kingdom, Australia, just to mention a few, to revisit this approach. And there are, in those countries that I've mentioned, particularly in New Zealand, joint select committees established. In New Zealand, it is called the Justice and Electoral Committee, to scrutinize the activities through their annual reports of their Electoral Commission. We have no such luxury and opportunity in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. So much so, Madam President, I am not breaking new ground. I am not making history by bringing this matter to the attention of this Honorable Senate, because of the fact that the Parliament does not have the power to scrutinize the activities of the Elections and Boundaries Commission. Persons, parliamentarians before me have had to bring private members' motions in order to deal with this entire issue of the Elections and Boundaries Commission. Madam President, subsequent to the 2000 general elections, which was held on December the 1st, or the 11th, I should say, 2000, the then opposition People's National Movement, through its MP, who is now Prime Minister, Diego Martin MP, Diego Martin West, then MP, now Prime Minister, filed and debated a private member's motion in which the member sought to persuade or to convince the House to establish a commission of inquiry into all the actions of the Elections and Boundaries Commission in the preparation of its preliminary and final voters lists, which were used in the December 11, 2000 general elections, and went on, Madam President, to call on the House to agree that the government provide through supplementary allocation all the necessary financial and other resources to effect an immediate, comprehensive, nationwide voter registration exercise, inclusive of a new voter identification system, as well as calling on the House at that time to have that exercise completed in the shortest possible time, with a view to having improved procedures and a revised voters list available well before any other national elections in the country. Madam President, I am bringing to your attention that the matter of the Elections and Boundaries Commission is not anything that is new or that is confined to what we are raising on this side of the House. As a result of that decision, that motion, when the PNM got into power in 2002, it was on the 29th of January 2002 that the President appointed a commission of inquiry into the functioning of the Elections and Boundaries Commission. That was done in 2002, Madam President. And the terms of reference for that commission of inquiry were as follows. Were the electoral lists for 2000 and 2001 general elections accurately compiled? Are the processes and procedures employed by the EBC conducive to accuracy of the electoral lists and the competent functioning of the EBC staff? And what changes, if any, should be made to ensure that the integrity of the electoral process is preserved? Madam President, that commission received 72 submissions. It held a series of public hearings between March the 13th, 2002 to May the 15th, 2002, and paid visits to selected offices of the EBC. That commission, Madam President, was chaired by the retired judge of the Supreme Court, Justice Leonard Dialsing. It included Professor Carl Theodore, Dr. Noel Kalicharan, Mrs. Myrtle Policio, and Mr. Kieron Arthur. These were the members of that commission. Madam President, I draw these matters to your attention and to the attention of this honorable House to let you know, as I said earlier, there should be no sacred cows in our nation. And every public authority, even enshrined or entrenched in our Constitution, should be subjected to parliamentary and public scrutiny. And that should be addressed through the appropriate amendment to the legislation, that is both the Constitution and our standing orders, Madam President. We are aware that the Elections and Boundaries Commission is an autonomous body created by the Constitution with the key tasks of directing and supervising the registration of voters and the conduct of elections in this country. And Madam President, in Section 71(1) of the Constitution of our Republic, it states that there shall be an Elections and Boundaries Commission for this country, and that this commission membership is outlined and the process of the appointment of the commission members. It states in subsection 8 that the commission may regulate its own procedure. And to demonstrate the kind of independence and the need for non-partisanship in its operations, the salaries and allowances of the staff of the commission shall be a charge on the consolidated fund. So under section 71, subsection 10, that is made abundantly clear, Madam President, that the commission staff salaries shall be a direct charge of the consolidated fund, Madam President. Madam President, the Elections and Boundaries Commission is also, as the motion indicates, must conduct free and fair elections. So the Election and Boundaries Commission is not only governed by the Constitution, it is also governed by what is known as the Representation of the People Act, which sets out the mechanics by which the EBC carries out its constitutional and legal functions, Madam President. Now, Madam President, if we go to the Representation of the People Act, Chapter 201, and you go to section part 1, and you go to subsection 3, it states, and I quote, subject to subsection 71 of the Constitution, in the exercise of its functions under the Constitution, the Commission shall exercise general direction and supervision over the administrative conduct of elections and enforce on the part of all election officers. Hear the words, Madam President. Fairness. May I repeat? Fairness. Impartiality. May I repeat? Impartiality and compliance with this act. It goes on to indicate, Madam President, in subsection 2 of clause of section 3, there shall be a chief election officer who shall, subject to any general or special directions of the Commission, perform such functions and duties and exercise such powers of the Commission in such a manner as the Commission may from time to time direct, including any of the following duties. And it goes on to outline, Madam President, the powers of the Chief Elections Officer. 1, to make such arrangements and to do such things as are necessary for the initiation and maintenance of the unit and central registers in accordance with this act, and for that purpose to make arrangements for the preparation and issue of the necessary forms and instruments, and for the collection and keeping of such records as may be necessary. The issue of elections officers, to issue rather to elections officers such instructions as he may from time to time deem necessary to ensure the effective execution of the provision of this Act, and to execute and perform all other powers and duties that by this Act or by the Commission are conferred or imposed on him. Now, Madam President, the Election and Boundaries Commission has a very serious duty and responsibility to ensure that the elections that are conducted by them are seen by the population as being conducted fairly, where there is neutrality, where there is impartiality, and, Madam President, not a hint of anyone under its watch being compromised or being able to be compromised or to taint or blemish the electoral process. Whenever that hint is given, it is cause for alarm. And that can lead, Madam President, to serious developments for the stability, for the peace, the good order, and government of our nation. Madam President, I want to tell you that Trinidad and Tobago, in its current state, faces a lot of dangers. Sometimes the dangers are so imperceptible. The eyes, the naked eyes, Madam President, cannot see because they are so imperceptible in terms of how they are reaching and coming. There's a book written by two gentlemen out of America. It is entitled How Democracies Die. I forget the name of the authors. How Democracies Die. And, Madam President, they were saying in that document, that book, that in the past, generals used to overthrow democratic regimes, like what happened in Chile under Allende in 1973, and in other countries in South America, and recently in Egypt, Madam President. But what the literature is revealing today is that elected members of Parliament, elected leaders, Madam President, are the ones who are, once they are placed in office, they are the ones who are subverting and compromising the entire democratic process. That is what these authors were saying, Madam President. And within a twinkle of an eye, a country that could be described as a laboratory of democracy can become a laboratory of authoritarianism and autocracy, just by a twinkle of an eye. And that is why, Madam President, it is so important that whatever we do, we as parliamentarians must guard jealously with our lives, if necessary, our independent institutions in this country. And we must do nothing to ensure that anything comes between that institution or those institutions and democracy. So, Madam President, whether it is a public service commission whether it is the Police Service Commission, whether it is Elections and Boundaries Commission, those institutions must be safeguarded, they must be protected, and they must be defended. We must defend the Constitution and those institutions that are entrenched in our Constitution, Madam President. And that is why, Madam President, we know that. That's why I'm asking for it to be disentrenched or detrenched or unhinged. Madam President, I want to bring to your attention, and I want to tell you, Madam President, that since I have known myself in public life, I have never witnessed a situation where a quasi-judicial body has as its chairman a political appointee. I have never witnessed that in my life, Madam President. Madam President, when you see these things beginning to emerge in your country, we have to take note. We have to take stock. We have to be alarmed. I have never seen a quasi-judicial commission, Madam President, having as its chairman a political appointee. I've never seen that. And you know, Madam President, what is worst, Madam President? If that had happened under the People's Partnership, there would have been blood and sand on the roads and streets of this country. Well, let me withdraw that, Madam President. There would have been a lot of concerns, Madam President. Let me withdraw it, Madam President. Yeah, there would have been a lot of concerns and challenges, Madam President. Madam President, could you imagine, that a member of a board appointed by the Kamla Prasad Bises's government to the Shagaramas Development Board being appointed as the chairman of the Police Commission, the Police Service Commission? Could you imagine that happening under the Kamla Prasad Bises's government? You have a political appointee appointed by a cabinet, by the Kamla Prasad Bisesa government, and that person is appointed as the chairman of the Police Service Commission in Trinidad and Tobago. Could you imagine?
No, Senator Mark. Permit me just to interrupt, and I do it reluctantly. But you're talking about the Police Service Commission, and I believe that is a process in the other place that is triggered by the President of the country. And therefore, you are bringing the President into the debate. And therefore, I'm going to ask you, whatever you have to say, you have to manage your information, please.
Yeah. So, Madam President, all I'm saying is that I am not querying or questioning. I am saying, Madam President, as parliamentarians, we ought to be conscious of these developments. And I am not querying or questioning the appointment of any person, Madam President. And I'm not even casting aspersions on any character involved in this exercise. I am bringing to the attention of the Honorable House, through you, some of the warning signs that are emerging, some of the dangers that are appearing, that we need as parliamentarians to be conscious of. That is all. We have to be conscious of these things, Madam President. Otherwise, if we are not conscious of these things, I would be accused of being derelict in my duty. Because if I knew of such a thing taking place in our country, and I did not bring it to your attention and to this House attention or this Senate attention, Madam President, I would be guilty of dereliction of duty. So I make it very clear, I am not attacking, I am not questioning, I'm not casting any aspersions on any appointment or any office holder, Madam President. I am dealing with a principle that is involved here. A principle. And that is what we should be concerned about as parliamentarians, Madam President. And Madam President, this is why I again say that when we look at the process, I want, Madam President, as I'm on this line, let me draw your attention to the Commission of Inquiry's report into this Election and Boundaries Commission. And this Commission of Inquiry report was done, as I said, by Mr. Lennox Dialsing. He was then a retired Supreme Court judge. It is dated Friday, the 31st of May. There were 23 recommendations that were submitted by the Dialsing Commission on this particular matter. But, Madam President, Justice Dialsing, as he was then and maybe still is today, made some very interesting statements. And again, it emphasizes the importance of us ensuring that we do nothing, Madam President, in this country to undermine, to subvert, to destabilize our democracy. We must do nothing to undermine our democracy. That is what is at stake here. Hear what this gentleman said, Madam President, in his report on page 12. He said, and I quote, "The electoral process is the bedrock of any democracy." We agree, Madam President. If there's a hint in this country, Madam President, I told you a short while ago that in 2000, the People's National Movement in opposition raised a hue and a cry over the election results of 2000. They accused the then government of voter pardon, of fraud, of stealing the elections. Yes. All of these things were done and said by the then PNM government. So important to them was the electoral process. And I don't agree with them. I do not agree with them. I support that position. Because if I were in their place, I would have been making the same noises. Because you cannot give anyone the hint that you are stealing an election. You cannot do that. You are going to have problems in a country like ours. So everything must be above board, and everybody must have confidence in the process that led to it, Madam President. So, Madam President, I go on. The will of the people is paramount, and it is through general elections that the people's will is expressed and determined. The electoral process starts long before voting day with continuous voter registration and the maintenance of a list of electors. Madam President, it goes on to say that the goal of any truly democratic government must be to ensure that any qualified person who wants to vote is given the opportunity to vote. And it said it is therefore, it is vital that our democracy, that systems and procedures be put in place to ensure the free and fair statement of the will of the people on election day. Anything which hinders or prevents a voter from casting his vote is unacceptable and must be viewed with serious concern. Madam President, my motion, or the motion I have advanced today, talks about the need for free and fair election. Madam President, there must never be an impression given in this country that critical office holders have any contact or relationship with any subsistent politician and holding high office. Madam President, it is wrong, and I'm not casting any aspersions on anyone. But Madam President, I will ask you from a hypothetical situation. Madam President, as I asked a colleague of mine some time ago, Madam President, if I were to ask or bring to your attention, or to bring to any other member's attention here, that the relative of the Member of Parliament for Oropouche East is the Chief Elections Officer of the Elections and Boundaries Commission of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Madam President, how would my colleagues react if you hear that the Member of Parliament for Oropouche East, cousin or relative, is the Chief Elections Officer of the Elections and Boundaries Commission? How would people react, Madam President? It is not to say, Madam President, Dr. Munilal's cousin or relative mightn't be fair, mightn't be objective, mightn't be impartial.
Senator Mark, you're dealing with a hypothetical situation, so just leave it at the member for, don't call any names. Okay?
Yeah, a member of Parliament, Madam President, without calling any names. Thank you for guiding me. Madam President, how would we feel, Madam President? And Madam President, this is why I raise this matter today, to bring to your attention the unease, the concern, the public's concern about developments that have taken place recently at the level of the Elections and Boundaries Commission. And as I said, I cast no aspersions on anyone. I call no names. I have names. I call no names. But I'm saying, how would one feel? Senator, you know and I know that if that was so, yeah, but I am saying, Madam President, that if my friend had known this, that had taken place with a member from our side, my friend would have been marching up and down the tongue. To the max. Madam President, calling for the removal of that individual from that position. But Madam President, as it is now, we say that the Elections and Boundaries Commission, which is a very important institution in our country, needs to pay attention to the perception that is being painted in the society today. The perception that is being given to the society today, that the people of this nation is not happy, is not comfortable, Madam President, with what is taking place at this time. And this is why I have asked you, Madam President, through you, and I hope that the Honorable Leader of Government Business will take note of this development, because it is of grave concern to the community, to the country, and to its future. And therefore, action must be taken by the government to have that individual placed in that office of the EBC either replaced or removed, and put somebody who is neutral, who is impartial, who is independent, and who cannot be questioned by the population. We need an independent person in that office. We do not want any hint, Madam President, of any relationship between X person or Y person. And we cannot have that.
Senator Mark, you have 5 more minutes.
So, Madam President, I am asking you that if at this moment we have a situation in which a relative of a sitting minister is the Chief Elections Officer, that person should be removed from that post and put somebody who is independent, impartial, neutral, and acceptable to the entire population. cannot continue how we are going. And Madam President, may I say in the few minutes I have, that I call on the government to take steps to bring the Elections and Boundaries Commission under parliamentary scrutiny in our parliament. We need, Madam President, if we had the scrutiny of the Election and Boundaries Commission by a JSC, a lot of things that are taking place right now at the EBC would not have gone on. We would have already brought them before the Parliament. Madam President, you remember the PSC in another place, appointed, and something went to that place, and that place decided to set up a select committee to call that PSC before it to explain its position. Now, I am saying, Madam President, when you have reports coming from that particular Election and Boundaries Commission, that Election and Boundaries Commission must come before the Parliament Joint Select Committee, as it does in New Zealand, in South Africa, in the United Kingdom, and in many other territories, and be able to be subjected to scrutiny, to accountability, to exchanges. Please explain your position. Why are you cutting up the boundaries like what you are doing? Madam President, as I said to you earlier on in my contribution, when a report comes to the Parliament, and it doesn't come here, Madam President, it only goes to the House of Representatives. When it comes to the House, which is wrong, because we are lawmakers, it should go to the both houses of Parliament. But when it comes to the Parliament, Madam President, either you accept it or you reject it and send it back to the EBC. The EBC must be able to come before a joint select committee of Parliament and explain why it has altered boundaries in Trinidad and Tobago. The EBC cannot hide behind a provision in the Constitution and says it is not subject to any authority or control and any direction, so they can do whatever they want, when they want, and nobody can ask them any questions. Madam President, the days of that are over. So we serve notice on the EBC today. We serve notice today on the Elections and Boundaries Commission that those days are over. The days of bringing a report and tabling it in the House of Representatives, and it's either we approve or we disapprove, and that's the end of it. And most of the time, we approve, and the next thing you know, 3 constituencies that were UNC go on PNM. Those days are over. Those days are over, Mr. EBC. So from now on, the EBC will be subjected, like the Police Service Commission, to the scrutiny of the House of Representatives. And they'll be subjected to the scrutiny of the Parliament. And I go further, Madam President, to ask the government to bring that EBC under some control and scrutiny by amending the laws so that we can bring that body under some scrutiny of the Parliament of the Republic of TNT. Cannot continue how we are going, Madam President. We need to ensure that there is accountability for the actions of the Elections and Boundaries Commission. Madam President, there are many things I know because of certain constraints I can't say, but I'll reserve that for the public platform. But there are many things that we are concerned about that can cause a lot of problems in this country if this government does not take action to remove the chief elections officer who is currently in place at the EBC from that office and replace that person immediately with a more independent, impartial, independent person, a neutral person, and not related to any minister. That must never happen, Madam President, in our country. We are looking for trouble. We are looking for trouble. Yes, Madam President, I'm about to wrap up. Yes. And I'm saying we are looking for trouble. Madam President, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity for saying I'm making this contribution. It's a very serious matter, and I hope that the government takes it very seriously. I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, the motion requires someone to second it.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I beg to second the motion, and I reserve my right to speak at a later stage in the debate. Thank you.
Honourable Senators, the motion has been seconded by Senator Amin. I will now propose the question for debate. The question is, whereas it is established by Section 71(1) and 12 of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago that there shall be an Elections and Boundaries Commission that in the exercise of its function shall not be subject to the direction or control of any person or authority. And whereas the Elections and Boundaries Commission is responsible for the holding of free and fair elections throughout Trinidad and Tobago, be it resolved that the Senate take note that the Elections and Boundaries Commission is not subject to any parliamentary scrutiny or accountability in respect of its activities and operations, unlike other similar independent bodies such as the service commissions. And be it further resolved that the Senate will call on the government to take urgent steps to introduce legislation that would make the Elections and Boundaries Commission accountable to the citizenry of Trinidad and Tobago by allowing parliamentary scrutiny of its administration, the manner of the exercise of its powers, methods of functioning, and any criteria adopted by the Commission in the exercise of its powers and functions. Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Madam President, thank you very much for allowing me to join the debate on this motion. Madam President, from the outset, let me express my complete disappointment with Senator Mark and his contribution. But Madam President, when I looked at the motion when it was first filed, there's a lot of weaknesses in the motion that I'll point out. But I felt, Madam President, that a discussion on the Elections and Boundaries Commission had its rightful place in the Parliament, because in the conduct of election and the oversight of the electoral process, it is one of the unique areas in which the executive, the judiciary, and the Parliament are fully engaged, each under the different pieces of legislation and consistent with many decisions which have been rendered on our electoral process. Each arm has its defined role and functions. And in something as important as the conduct of the elections, for the purpose of constituting this Parliament, I felt that it was useful to have a discussion on the Elections and Boundaries Commission. But, Madam President, I was very surprised in the second part of the contribution to understand really what this motion is about. This motion, clothed as an attempt to bring scrutiny to the EBC, is really an attack on the independence of the Public Service Commission. Because I could not believe. I recall a question, or more than one questions, being asked in the Parliament about the appointment of the Chief Elections Officer. And I've read a press release from the Public Service Commission in which the Commission took responsibility for that appointment as it is entitled to under the law. So I did not plan a response on behalf or a defense of the Public Service Commission. And clearly, Senator Mark planned an attack on the Commission. Because for 20 minutes, we understood what this was about. This was the senator being unhappy with an appointment made by a body that he has touted the independence of the body. The independence of the body is not in question. And my first comment on the motion and its contribution is that it's an unwarranted, unnecessary, and it demeans this House. And not because the standing orders provides for a private motion to be filed. a true reading or any reading, an upside-down reading of the standing orders, does not empower anybody to use this House to attack an independent body. The process, and you know, my friends are armed with excellent judicial review lawyers. And if ever there was a case, there is one thing I stood right here some months ago, and I spoke about particular pieces of legislation and development in our law that I felt took us along the correct road of jurisprudence, in particular in relation to public interest. And two of the things I pointed to was, one, the placement in statutory form of the right of judicial review. And we've seen, flowing from the enactment of the law, a steady stream of cases, many of them successful in relation to the defense of the rights of the average citizen of this country, who believe that somehow public authorities in their decision-making had infringed their rights. But perhaps today, I'd refer to the second thing I spoke about previously, and that is the removal of the ouster clause. Because it is inconceivable now, as it was at the time of its removal, that we could ever operate in an environment in which public authorities making decisions which affected individual rights did not have a responsibility to provide reasons for their decision, and also were not accountable to anybody. And the removal of the ouster clause in the Constitution made bodies like the Public Service Commission open to scrutiny and question. And the Judicial Review Act, Madam President, provides 15 grounds on which an aggrieved person or someone representing the interests of an aggrieved person could question the decision-making process of the Public Service Commission. And if Senator Mark believes that there is a decision that ought to be challenged, and if he feels strongly about it, my position is that is the place in judicial review proceedings and not this honorable House. And it should not be something that we ever support in this House or elsewhere. Madam President, Senator Mark also referred to the call by my colleague back in 2001 for a commission of inquiry into the functioning of the EBC. And he read parts of that report by Justice Dial Singh and the members of the committee, the 5-member committee. But he failed to tell this House the most important thing about that report, Madam President. And if ever there was a case for being careful in how we examine or interface, we as the beneficiaries of the electoral process, and we as politicians, if there's ever a case for being careful, it was what followed that report, and not the report in itself. And I want to refer to specific aspects of that report. But my friend failed to tell this House that having rendered this report, the Dial Singh Commission faced judicial review proceedings, and this report was quashed. And it was quashed because of the findings of the court in relation to the contents of the report and the failure of the commissioners to afford due process and natural justice to those who were named in the report and whose rights were affected by the report. So the report was quashed. And in doing that, we understand that there must be process, and certain things, not everything, can be open to public scrutiny, but everything is capable of coming into the public domain. And I'll tell you how things in the EBC come into the public domain, and how the law provides for things relating to elections and the functioning of the EBC to come into the public domain without having to come through a joint select. Because the Parliament is not the only place for due process and scrutiny and examination and information of the public. In the separation of powers, there are different places, all covered by some form of legislation and some form of process. The other thing I want to say before I get into the report, Madam President, is to say what I have pointed, and I credit my colleague, Senator Khan, for pointing this out very early in our term in office. And that is that there are three things which has been a consistent line in the opposition in this House. And that is, the opposition consistently seeks to deny the executive the authority which properly belongs to the executive. So whenever we are dealing with an issue in which the executive is properly exercising its functions, the opposition is critical of that. The second thing, the opposition has been consistent in seeking to place elsewhere authority which properly belongs to the executive. So on many occasions when we come to deal with legislation, the opposition is calling upon us, for no valid reason, to place executive authority in the hands of somebody else. And the third pattern of behavior is a consistent line in which the opposition is seeking to whittle away at the existing executive authority with a redundant phrase about lack of trust in the government, in the executive, or a lack of trust in specific ministerial portfolios. Of course, consistently saying it's not the individual we are targeting. So when the legislation calls for the Minister of Finance to exercise authority, the response is we do not want a minister. And the addition to that is not that minister, but a minister. We want the president we want the Judicial and Legal Services Commission. We want somebody else. Things that belong to the executive, because my response to all of that has always been, for example, this. If this call for scrutiny and change in the law and all of that was so important to my friends, why didn't you do it? Why didn't you do it? And my question to you, because changes in the law must always address a mischief. And apart from the sky is falling, they put somebody I don't like as chief election officer. You have pointed to no mischief that has arisen from the election of from September 2015. We've had the election, general election. We've had the Tobago House of Assembly election. We had the local government election in 2016. And you have offered not one line from the EBC or from any other reliable source which points to something that happened from 2015 to now that ought to be cured by changes in the legislation. And the irony is that I agree with you, as I said from the start. I agree with you that as a democracy, we must continuously examine the elections process. I agree with you. But what I do not agree with is the use of a private motion to settle personal scores. Because, Madam President, going back to this report, the report of the Commission of Inquiry into the functioning of the Elections and Boundaries Commission of Trinidad and Tobago, dated Friday, 31st May 2002. A report, as I said, that the court quashed. It was an example, the very thing you asked for, that the EBC is not under scrutiny. This was a form of scrutiny. A properly constituted commission of inquiry observing due process is an example of a form of scrutiny into the EBC or any other institution in this country. It is not that we are lacking, but we use different avenues to deal with the issues before us. And in appointing this commission, the view was that the 2001 and 2000 elections ought to be examined. And as I said, the report itself highlights the danger, because at paragraph 289, I will read for you some 3 paragraphs of what the report says. And nobody slightly schooled in the law will countenance statements like this being made in relation to any institution or individual in this country. And I quote, "The EBC, we found, sees itself as an autonomous body circumscribed by an act and the rules appended thereto. It is not prepared to venture outside the act and rules except where it is absolutely necessary to do so. It does not see itself as a proactive institution. It sees itself more as a government department rather than an institution which is the guardian of the electoral process, in a sense, a guardian of democracy. In Trinidad and Tobago, this being so, it has no vision." That is the report, paragraph 289 of the Commission's report. It goes on to say, "The EBC has become a prisoner of legal definitions of duty and power. It does not see duty, as indeed it must do, but it sees no real need or urgency to exercise its powers to bring about updated electoral lists and an informed public." And I'll read paragraph 297. "Independent persons who accept appointment to independent constitutional commissions and upon whom vital constitutional and legal functions are imposed must carry about those functions efficiently and effectively. If they cannot do so, whatever the reason, they must resign." They must resign. Now, what are the commissioners saying in this report? They are saying that the EBC is sticking to the law. And if there is ever a place where the law requires that you stick to the strictest interpretation of the law, it is in the conduct of the people's elections. As we saw in the applications brought in relation to the 2015 general election, the court insisted on strict interpretation of the law, in particular, the time limit for doing certain things. Because that is the fundamental thing about elections. There must be absolute clarity. It must be defined. Those involved in the processes, we in this House, had to come here Saturday to amend the law to allow the THA 1 extra day for the election, because the law requires 21 clear days or 20 or so. And in order to preserve the process and to hold the process and ultimately the outcome of the election inviolable, we came to the House on a Saturday morning to fix that. so that, and the authority throughout, in every one of our islands, more outside than here, in Dominica and St. Lucia, there are consistently election petitions brought after election. And the case involving Winston Peters is always cited as authority. But of course, in those jurisdictions, the judgments are consistent in saying Trinidad and Tobago's process is different from many of the islands, because in Trinidad and Tobago, we have gone beyond the Constitution, which created the EBC, and the Representation of the People Act, and we have specifically incorporated the rules of the Supreme Court in the election petition process. And that is what makes us fairly unique in our part of the region, and why on many occasions judges of the island decline to use Peters as an authority in dealing with procedural matters in election petition proceedings. But this commission, and I didn't bring the commission into this inquiry, you brought the commission of inquiry into it. This commission committed a fundamental flaw in their reasoning. They were going against the grain of well-established authority. Unlike you, Senator Mark, today, they found themselves on dangerous ground because they were asking and they were condemning a constitutionally constituted commission to go outside the ambit of the law, to ramage. And when we come to the people's election process, there is no room to go to the left or to the right. The law must be strictly applied. And you know what was, Senator Mark, why I found your motion, if it was well-intentioned, to be important? At paragraph 306 of the report, I'll read it for you. It says, and I quote, "Because of time constraints, we regret that we have been unable to deal with that aspect of our terms of reference relating to ensuring that members of the staff of the Elections and Boundaries Commission exercise their functions competently and in accordance with democratic practice and principle." Now, isn't that surprising? That a commission of inquiry appointed to review the conduct of 2 elections and the functioning of the EBC, having rendered a report and having reached to the 306th paragraph of that report, having called for the commissioners of the EBC to resign, then tells you, we regret that we were unable to check the employees of the EBC to see if they are exercising their functions competently and in accordance with democratic practice and principle. In other words, the commission told you, we didn't even check the engine room. We didn't even look. That is where the work of the EBC goes on. Not in the minds of the commissioners. The work of the EBC goes on by the persons employed in the EBC, the ones in the field and the field office, and the ones preparing the registers and taking the registration information and providing oversight of the election. That is where the democracy takes place. And this commission had no time to check on that. And if they had even followed the due process, this report had no ground to stand on. Madam President, looking at the motion makes some assumptions, and I will go into the motion. The first is that in the first paragraph on the motion, Senator Mark tells us that in the exercise of the functions of the EBC, it shall not be subject to the direction or control of any other person or authority. Now, that may be so. But what this section, what this provision in the law targets, it's not putting the EBC out of the reach of scrutiny. That in itself is not evidence of lack of scrutiny, because in this country, elections are conducted, as I said before, under the Representation of the People Act. And this very lengthy piece of legislation, supported by election rules and registration rules and specimen forms and so on, contain in detail how our elections are conducted and the whole apparatus and bureaucracy and so on. It is very robust. But the most important part of that is that if anybody wishes to question the process, someone's candidacy in the election, the qualification to be selected, the events of election day, this is the process, this is the place. And in questioning the nomination of a candidate, in questioning the qualification of a candidate, in questioning the conduct of the election, you are bringing the EBC under scrutiny. That is the purpose of the Representation of the People Act. It covers a wide range. Part 1, the officers of the Commission, starting with the Chief Election Officer. The process of registration, the election itself, the writ of election and the rules of the election, and the details of the rules are constituted in lengthy rules of election. The campaign, the appointment of agents and sub-agents, elections expenses, the requirement for the deposit, the requirement for declaration, the requirement to be able to vouch your expenses. You have faced 3 elections, Senator Mark, you know. Offenses. And the longest part, Senator Mark, the longest part of the Representation of the People Act is the parts dealing with offenses. This is more criminal law than election. But the reasons why we have so many offenses here created in relation to every step of the process is because the law recognizes, and legislators like you and I recognize, the need to have free and fair election evidenced by the opportunity of someone qualified to vote to exercise their franchise without interference. And that is what this is here. And my point to you is that because we don't have a JSC to oversee the EBC, does not mean that the EBC is not under scrutiny. The EBC, throughout this legislation, in fact, early in the Representation of the People Act, when you get to Section 26, you start seeing the scrutiny. If the EBC refuses the registration of a potential voter, that disenfranchised person can make an application to the Court of Appeal. That is where it starts. Someone who believes that they should be registered and has been refused by the EBC has a right of recourse to the Court of Appeal to challenge the decision of the EBC and the failure to register. And from Section 6, as you course through the Act, you see requirements, you see process, you see time limits, but most importantly, you see the ultimate opportunity for scrutiny, which is to challenge decisions made along the way leading up to the casting of a vote on election day. And, Madam President, the reports, and I heard mention of reports and reporting and so on. In some countries, the law provides for the election authority, whether it's a commission or whatever election body, to report to Parliament. And in some cases, those reports are open for debate. And in our country, the law provides for reports to be treated in a particular way. And in Part 5 of the Representation of the People Act, we see the treatment of proceedings after the poll. And in particular, it sets out what happens with the documentation, the ballots and the other documents, the list, the completed list and all of that. It sets out what happens to it. And the reason all of that is set out is because it preserves the evidence and the information to which someone who wishes to challenge the process will have recourse. And when you get to section 108, then you see what eventually is to be found on the website of the Elections and Boundaries Commission. And that section 108, subrule 6, says, and I read, "The Commission shall immediately after each election cause to be printed a report giving the number of votes polled for each candidate by polling divisions, the number of rejected ballots, the number and names on the revised list of electors and on the revised list of special electors, and any other information that it may deem fit to include, and shall forthwith forward a copy of the report to the person set out in subrule 5B, and the persons set out in 5B include the Minister with responsibility for local government." So if Senator Mark, for example, if you go on the EBC's website, you see dating back to the Legislative Council, the reports of every election, and you see in the opening part of all those reports, the Commission reporting on a number of things, including recommendation. In fact, a few elections ago, I can't remember the election, it might have been either 2007, you see the Commission reporting on the issue of campaign finance reform and talking about what they saw in the election campaign and how that compares to the reports they got on the expenditure. And they were questioning whether the expenditure reported truly reflects the cost and what is involved in running a modern election campaign in Trinidad and Tobago. And if you go to the report on the local government election, for example, the one 2016, you see a letter dated 16 November 2017 to the Honorable Minister of Rural and Local Government Election, where the Elections and Boundaries Commission is providing the Minister with a complete report on the conduct of the election. None of this is hidden. The fact that this is not tendered in this form to the Parliament does not mean that it escapes scrutiny. And it comes to the Minister, who is a politician who sits in the executive and in the cabinet, and it gives that Minister the opportunity to make representations to the cabinet in relation to the conduct of elections based on what is put before the Minister. And in each report, you will see some form of recommendation. You would see some form of recommendation coming forward. Madam President, the process is different in other jurisdictions. I'll go quickly to two jurisdictions. In Germany, for example, the Bundestag has something called a Committee for the Scrutiny of Elections, Immunity, and the rules of procedure in the German Bundestag. And that committee has three main functions. And the first function, and Senator Mark, you would like this, is electoral scrutiny. That committee is given the power to deal with any objection to the federal elections. It's a specific power given under Article 41 of the German Basic Law. In addition to that, there are two other powers relating to members' immunity
Minister,
and
you have 5
procedural
more minutes.
matters. Thank you very much. Procedural matters. But this committee covers a strange combination of the electoral process and the affairs within the House. And it allows that committee to do what the combination of the EBC and the judiciary do in our jurisdiction and have done well. In Pakistan, for example, there is a current discussion in Pakistan, and I know you would like this, Senator Mark. There's a current discussion, and this is based on a publication of March 23, 2018, and that discussion deals with the issue of boundaries. And you made a statement here, and I'm not sure I heard it correctly, but the matter of the determination or the report on the boundaries comes to this Parliament, as you know. And the question in Pakistan was whether the election body should be dealing with boundaries or whether it should be some other independent body dealing with the boundaries. So it is a matter that is currently being debated. And of course, what is driving this discussion in Pakistan is you have people, like on the other side of me, you have people who believe that there is independent and there is more independent. And I don't trust the independent, so I have to create my own idea of independence. But if the legislation provides for that body to create the boundaries, and you do not have a legitimate complaint on the work of the EBC, of the election body in dealing with the matter, then you ought not to be complaining. And as I said before, today I listened intently. I barely slept last night when Senator Khan told me that I was going in today because I was excited. I was looking forward to this motion. And I sat and I said, well, it's coming. The mischief, this thing, this Pandora's box that opened home by Senator Mark is it turned out to be an attack on the Public Service Commission. Imagine that. Wanting to weaken one independent body, the Elections and Boundaries Commission, and wanting to destroy another body because you don't like what they decide. And another model is the Canadian model. And in Canada, the matter of elections the matter is dealt with on a provincial level and a federal level. And on a federal level, you have Elections Canada, which is the equivalent of our EBC. And you have something that we don't have. The matter of election offenses are dealt with separately by a chief electoral officer working within the office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. And that is meant to ensure that there is absolute detachment on the prosecution of electoral offenses in Canada. And it's not that you don't have offenses. You have a lot of offenses. You have a lot of things happening. And it is not part of the work of Election Canada, but it is a separate part that resides in the Director of Public Prosecution. And under the Canada Elections Act 2000, the legislation provides for election issues to be contested by application. It sets out which are the courts that could deal with those matters. It sets out the rules of procedures and the time limit and all of that. It sets it out there. In the Canadian system too, and you'll be heartened to hear this, in the Canadian system there is a committee called the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. And that committee most recently considered the 23rd report and the 23rd report in response to the Chief Electoral Officer's recommendation for legislative reforms following the 42nd general election. In other words, the Chief Election Officer, while our EBC tenders the report to the minister and to other persons named in the election rules, in the Canadian system, the Chief Electoral Officer tenders the report to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs, and it is examined there.
Minister, your time is up.
Thank you.
Senator Roach.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I usually come in a bit late in the debates, and as a result, most times we don't have much to say because most of what I would have wanted to contribute would have probably been said by the several senators before me. But I must, before I embark upon this, my contribution, which, like Senator Clarence Rambarant was saying, that he was excited about this debate, and then he was sidetracked, having come and being a bit disappointed. I too was a bit excited about it, and what I want to say is that all credit to Senator Wade Mark. He is someone, a member of these chambers, who have been in the political arena, or in the parliament, for I think with experience spanning something like 28 years. And as a result of that, he would have gained a lot of experience and is somewhat like an institution in our democracy, and which we all can learn something from. I think he has a lot to impart upon us, and we can learn from him both positively and in some instances negatively. But I prefer to learn any positive from him. It also applies to the other side too. There are members on the other side who you can learn from both positive and negatively alone. So the task or the challenge for us independents is always to sift through the politics and get to the trust of what it is. Not to be too taken up with the messenger, but the message that is being put before us, so that we can assist in executing our duty to the public, which is to do what we believe is in the best interest of the public without fear or favor. Now, having said that, when I looked at the motion before us, and I read it, whereas it is established by Section 71(1) and 12 of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, that there shall be an Electoral and Boundaries Commission that in the exercise of its function shall not be subject to the direction or control of any other person or authority. Immediately I paused, and I paused and I looked at the Constitution, the current Constitution, our Republican Constitution, to basically inform myself as to the accuracy of the sections being quoted and so forth. I went on. And whereas the Electoral and Boundaries Commission is responsible for holding free and fair elections throughout Trinidad and Tobago, which I believe is also true. And I pause and I reflect upon the EBC as I know it, my experience in the EBC. And the EBC, fortunately for Trinidad and Tobago's political history, we have had successive elections from 1962, I believe, to present time, where several governments have changed, and members here have been on either side of the divide, excluding us here in the independent bench. And this has been, and nothing has ever been laid to the public, has been made, representative made to the public that our elections was anything but free and fair elections. And for that, we must give congratulations to the successive chairpersons of the Election and Boundaries Commission, starting from, I think, from Sir Alan Rees, I think I have a listen. Alan Rees, there were about 5 of them. There was Alan Rees, there was Sir Isaac Hayatali, Oswald Wilson, Robert Manson, and presently we have Mark Ramcarry Singh. And I think no one can call into question the integrity of those honorable gentlemen in holding our institution to be one that is, I guess, can be to the envy of most of the world. We have been able to, with all the disturbance and the rattlings of race, politics, inequity in our society and so forth, if it's one thing we have been able to achieve consistently is changing of government without the bullet, but by the ballot, and that is commendable to Trinidad and Tobago. Now, I ask myself, when you continue reading the entire motion, it seems on the face of it to be one that is constructive and one that can lend in helping to strengthen our institutions in terms of being more transparent and accountable. So, the lawyer I am, public lawyer as well, like Senator Clarence Rambarat, the first thing that jumped out at me, what is the mischief that is getting at with this? And I had posed the cause. What is the mischief really and truly? Is it that this motion is suggesting that we may be in a situation where the EBC is not living up to its function and its integrity of being an institution that is independent and an institution that is not capable of executing and securing elections to be free and fair? And I kept wondering, and I said, well, as far as my memory served me, I have never been aware of that in Trinidad and Tobago. Again, I engaged in some further discussions and research, and nothing was able to come up. Even the election petitions that have been filed in the court in Trinidad and Tobago, not one of them I think have ever been successful. No election petition has been successful in Trinidad and Tobago in discrediting the affairs of the EBC, so to speak, right? Now, that being the case, I ask myself, therefore, what is the urgency of bringing such a motion, right? It is one that I say that is commendable in the sense that whatever one can do in our dynamic democracy in this ever-changing world to help bring greater scrutiny and transparency in our institutions that represent the interests of the country should be done. But when I listened to Senator Mark's contribution today, I must say I was a bit taken back. I was a bit disappointed because I thought a lot more he was going to give some sort of flesh onto the urgency of having the institution of the EBC brought into question here. And I started to even play with some thoughts and ideas of if that is the case and we were to support his motion and having it brought before a joint select committee through whatever arrangement, standing orders or law as the case may be, what type of a joint select committee would be necessary to ensure that? And immediately again came to mind that I'm saying if this was to be the case, it would have to be a joint select committee that is certainly chaired and vice chaired by independent senators and supported by the independent senators who will occupy the majority of the seats there in order to keep it independent, if we were to reach there. But I asked myself, is this necessary at this point in time? I said, if we are serious about showing up the integrity and the process of our electoral elections being free and fair and continuing to have elections that we can feel proud about, to me, the most urgent need in this is campaign finance. Campaign finance is the thing that's supposed to be before us with a great urgency, not trying to bring the EBC before us in any form through joint select committee as is being suggested. And as has been said before, you have a number of instances in the Representative People's Act under the Constitution itself that secures the accountability of the EBC as it exists today. It is also financially audited by the Auditor General. You have the petitions that you have judicial review, which is available as a public body. You have the instance of the staff of the EBC being provided by the Public Service Commission, which is an independent institution as well. So you have a number of checks and balances as we speak that exist to secure that independence of the EBC, right? And to give the people trusted in the electoral process as administered by them. So when I heard the comment being made, I was glad that it was reiterated by Senator Mark, that his concern was the appointment of somebody in the process that is aligned to somebody who's a minister or whatever, just like that. The fact is, what has not been alleged is that that person was appointed by any political party directly. The person was, based on what I'm hearing, was being appointed by the Public Service Commission. By the Public Service Commission. So I think we have to be very careful as we deal with things like elections, that how government is changed, that we do not easily or recklessly bring into question the integrity of the institution. I think we'll be doing ourselves a great disservice. The people of Trinidad and Tobago will be doing a great disservice rather than we doing them a good. And therefore, the critical analysis that I would have liked to have bring to this debate is not necessary at this point in time, because I do not think the EBC is in any way threatened or being undermining in being able to deliver elections, as it has done successfully over the years, to be free and fair, and to be staffed by persons who are independently appointed to the EBC to be his officials. And when I looked, I went back again, I said, you know, what is the thinking of the forefathers of our Constitution? So I went back to the Ordering Council in 1962 to see exactly what was the arrangement, what was the thought behind the Ordering Commission, what was the debate that took place in our Republican Constitution in 1976. And all I could have seen from the contribution from some of it, I couldn't have read all of them within a short space of time from some of the senators, is that what was done in 1962 Constitution, the EBC, which is now the EBC unified as one body, was separated. It was the Election and Boundaries Commission and the Election Commission. And what it did, they fused them and made it one, right? So that was the only change substantially that was done between the 1962 Constitution and the 1976 Republican Constitution. Nothing else was changed. And it lends credence to the fact that whatever the arrangement was in 1962, later on in 1976, the situation, yes, the societies continued to evolve. There was no need to undermine or to bring it anymore into the realms of the scrutiny of the politician. Now, saying this, I mean, you may bring the EBC to a joint select committee, so you want to bring it under parliamentary scrutiny. But unless that you say you're using the model that I suggested, you have an independent senators being on top and being the majority of it, it will not necessarily escape the influence by pressure, subtle or otherwise, of a joint select committee where the majority are elected members, are politicians. So it could be undermined in that way. So, you know, nothing ever 100%. So I will be, I mean, yes, in other countries, you have independent commissions. They are known by a number of different nomenclature. I see in South Africa, the election, called judicial branch, different things they are called. But at the end of the day, some of them, they have different arrangements. Our arrangement has worked for us successfully without failure. And the fact that I have been part of 2 parliaments in the last 5 years, and the government have changed successfully. And there has never been a cry that the elections were not free and fair. And I think that as the old adage people say, that if it's in break, why fix it? Right? Why fix it? Why? We have more urgent concerns in the society at this point in time that I think we need to be attending ourselves to our minds, using this time to really do that. This is not in any way to be disrespectful to my learned colleague, Senator Wade Mark. As I said, he's somebody that I believe is very valuable. He's somebody that I prune what he says, but to get the good out of it, because he has a lot of good he has. And but I do not think is one of his best choices of debate in giving the time. The legislative agenda that we have seems to be quite crowded and urgent. This is not something I think urgently should worry or should captivate our attention at this point in time. So so I will hasten to say it's not a motion that I will be supportive of, not because it doesn't the integrity. It is not one that at some later stage may be relevant to us to look at. We have to continually look at it, how to improve it. But for now, there's nothing that's before us, even by Senator Mark, to cause us to be saying that, like I said, we need to get this to be more vigilant. We need to tap these loose and this is a mischief or mischiefs that have been existing. That is not before us. So, Madam President, as I said, this was one I was getting excited to be able to say a lot more and learn a lot more. I mean, I have a set of literature that I have researched into electoral college, election and boundaries commissions as they exist in the Commonwealth and all over. But I don't think it is relevant at this point in time. So again, even though I'm speaking early, I don't have much to say. So I thank you very much.
Senator Haynes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President, for the opportunity to participate in the debate on this motion brought by Senator Mark on behalf of the opposition bench. And as I prepared for the debate, and as usual, there's several pieces of paper on my desk because I did quite a bit of research preparing for this debate because like the senators before me, I was also very excited to participate in what I consider to be yet another conversation in how we as a young democracy can build and strengthen our institutions so that they are more reflective of the aspirations of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And so when I looked at Senator Mark's motion that dealt with what is in essence one of the most critical elements of any democracy, free and fair elections throughout Trinidad and Tobago, I knew that today was going to be an important debate, given that all of our members here, I believe, stands for fairness, stands for transparency, stands for accountability, and can understand where the motion is coming from in its essence, which is that as we think about democracy and as we think about nation building and as we think about what kind of Trinidad and Tobago we would like to see, and we evaluate our institutions under that lens, then we can understand where there can be a need for parliamentary scrutiny of the powers under the that the Election and Boundaries Commission currently hold. So, Madam President, as I began looking through, I started with a report of the Global Commission on Elections, Democracy, and Security. And this report looks at elections globally and what they mean to our human rights and the development of democratic rights. And the report notes that in a global recession and rising economic inequality, these things are putting pressures on democracies as you now have a situation where in times of turmoil or where countries face factors that, like ours, where you have, rising crime, you have economic concerns and joblessness, that this also puts pressures on your democracies and your democratic systems. So that when senators spoke today and said, well, why are we looking at this now and what is the mischief that we are hoping to cure? My concern was not so much that there's a mischief that needs to be cured as in such as that we must look more at, are there ways we can strengthen deficiencies before they arise so that we can be proactive rather than reactive? And I think we've heard time and time again in the Senate that why are we always reacting to concerns? And I think what Senator Mark was trying to do and is trying to do, and is to be proactive in the development of our institutions, so that when we think about systems, we think about how they can work effectively for our country. And Senator Rembrandt called the motion on Minister, Rembrandt, thank you, called the motion unwarranted and unnecessary. And I think because of the lens at which the minister looked at Senator Mark's contribution, that from that lens, the minister arrived at these conclusions. But had you broadened the lens from what the intent is to strengthen our institutions for the best interest of our country, then I think that you would find that it is very necessary and very important that we could have these discussions, and then we can agree or disagree. But it is important that we are always thinking about aspirational goals, because Trinidad and Tobago is a young democracy. We are, in this wider scope of things, we are at a juncture, where we can look at all of our institutions and say, okay, is this the best route? Are we doing this in the best way possible? Is there more that we can do? And I think, as I looked, and I also looked at a practitioner's report on electoral commissions, and I'll get to that shortly, which kind of contextualize electoral commissions and how they function and where they locate themselves in the space of democracy. And these are, again, important discussions, because you can agree or disagree, but the discussions should be had as a young democracy as we look to move forward as a nation. And I think it's important to note that when discussing elections, and as Senator Roach noted, we have had a history of free and fair elections, and that's something that we can all be grateful for, because nations who would have gained their independence at the same time as ours they have not fared as well. But the reason we can boast about things like a fair handover of power and an open handover of power is because we as a nation have determined that we will trust our process. And in order to continue to do so, I think there is a role for us as a parliament to evaluate our process and to look at, again, whether or not we're doing this in the best way possible. Is that the ultimate goal of this is that we can have confidence in the results, confidence in the process, in the way the elections were conducted, and then this is how we judge our successes overall. And while nothing may be broken, are we doing it in the best way possible? You see, an electoral commission falls under the category of institutions broadly grouped as electoral management bodies. And when you look at the criteria for electoral management models, there are a number of bodies that study how international best practice. So I will go through a couple of those. And I think that will help contextualize whether or not we can agree or disagree that the systems that we have in place now are the systems that we want and that they represent what we hope to see as a nation. You see, there are models, and I'm quoting here from a practitioners network case study in which the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission they were looking at the kind of selection criteria for electoral commissioners used in respective countries. And this was published on June 22nd, 2009. And if you'd allow me to just quote parts of it here. An election management body or bodies responsible for electoral management the mix and choice of how to organize these bodies in specific countries are largely as a result of the country of each country's socioeconomic space. And so what that says is that countries can evaluate their commissions based on their reality as it exists in real time. So there's a government model of the Electoral Management Board where elections are organized and managed by the executive branch of government through a ministry. And this occurs in countries like Sweden, where there's a long-established system of democracy and where they can trust the system. And so when Minister Rambrat said that there's a continuing line from the opposition that we would like to remove power from the executive where it resides, I mean, yes, but we're not. When we are coming again from a political philosophy, and it's something that I personally stand by, where we would like to see power checked and that there be checks and balances for all powers. And it's not going to change if the seats change. So the things that we are advocating for don't end at the end of an election if we become the government and they become the opposition. They continue. And so I don't understand where the discomfort is. Because if we're saying that there should be additional checks and balances, it does not mean additional checks and balances for only the PNM, because if you're no longer the government, the checks and balances will continue to stand. And I said that because in my discussion, as I prepared today, I noted that there are systems where electoral management can coexist with the executive, and that was a space that we could discuss and look at as we move forward. It's not something that I personally agree with, but it exists, right? And it's because there are countries where their reality is such that the democracy is well established, that the executive can house this kind of power within their jurisdiction. However, there's a mixed model of the election management board where two or more bodies can share the responsibility. So on one hand, there's the government component, which organizes the elections, and then there's the independent structure, which oversees and monitors them. And you see, this allows for additional. And then the last model is the one that we have here, which is an independent model, which uses a structure where the institution is independent and autonomous from the government, and they organize and manage the election. And this last model is not accountable to any government ministry or department, but they note here may be accountable to the legislature and the judiciary or the head of state. So where you house the accountability is also a conversation that we can have. And I think Minister Rambrat noted that it is his belief that the accountability is housed under the judiciary, and he's comfortable with that. But what we're saying is that we are not comfortable with that, and we would like to have an additional layer of scrutiny via the legislature. And in this context of a young democracy, that is a constructive and warranted conversation that should be had, because we are a society that gets extremely preoccupied with elections. Where you have there are countries where an election time is a very sobering and quiet time. And then there's Trinidad and Tobago, where... Well, no, I don't mean us alone, but I'm just using us as a context where an election time generates not just a lot of interest, but it is a loud experience. There's a lot of excitement. I think I've had, in 2015, some of my friends who did the political science major along with me were in Trinidad and Tobago for our election, and they were amazed by the music trucks and the motorcades. It's just something that's unheard of in their context. And so, when you look at the way the elections preoccupy the minds of our citizens, it is very important for us to be very invested in strengthening the institutions that participate in this very important part of our democracy. And so electoral policy and oversight policy, when you're thinking about it, you have to contextualize it within your country. And in Trinidad and Tobago, where everybody knows somebody and everybody knows somebody else, where the perception of any kind of interference can really find its way into our conversation, into our national conversation, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And what we're seeing is that if that space is opened, then you create an even greater space for questions to be asked. And this is something that where it can be prevented, it should be prevented. And I don't see why anyone would disagree with something as logical as that. In some places, an electoral management body is responsible for as far as of drafting and reviewing proposed electoral legislation and electoral oversight, legislation for electoral oversight and supervision. And so, again, when examining what our electoral process looks like, we as citizens, I think, first and foremost, because that's where you should come, that's the angle you should look at this motion from as a citizen. Locate yourself in the country and think about your electoral management body and think about what is the best option you would like to see. And would you not like to be able to ask questions and have a fair, transparent assessment of how you elect the leaders of your country? I think that, to me, it's not something that should worry us if we are asking questions. It's something that we should be grateful for the opportunity to do. Part of this Zimbabwe study looked very carefully at how persons are located within electoral management commissions. The study noted that regardless of how the body is constituted, the persons who are employed generally require a mixture of an administrative and logistics operations. But what they said is, in a sense, the skills needed to compose an electoral management body consequently span a range of fields, including management, integrity, professionalism, technical competence. And it is therefore very important that each country carefully selects its mix of members and keeping in mind their qualification, as well as depending on the circumstances at hand in every country. So most independent bodies look at not just your academic qualifications, but also, when they say you can train talent and you can train talent, but you should hire character, in terms of looking at, are you committed to independence? Are you committed to integrity? And those broad characteristics that would create a confidence in our institution that is undeniable. And the study noted that a number of advertisements for persons to be hired within commissions, etc., talk about a proven track record for integrity and honesty in public and private life, as well as loyalty to duties and functions of the office, and not personal loyalties. Expert-based management bodies are quite common and found in countries such as Australia, Bangladesh, Canada, Costa Rica, India, Indonesia, Poland, Thailand, and Ukraine. So it's not something that is unusual or unheard of, that when you are talking about who is located within your electoral commission, to be very circumspect as to every area of their personal integrity, and because it does form part of the system. And I think it would be naive to think that it can exist outside of the system of elections, as well as the perception of free and fair elections. The important role of the Election Commission is to the important role of the Election Commission cannot be understated, but the role of the persons who form the day-to-day operations of the commission must also be part of the discussion, and not something that we are offended by or something that we think creates a space or room or avenue for mischief. It is standard practice internationally. And I think as we look at the motion as presented by Senator Mark, he says that whereas the Elections and Boundaries Commission is responsible for holding free and fair elections throughout Trinidad and Tobago, be it resolved that the Senate take note that the Elections and Boundaries Commission is not subject to any parliamentary scrutiny or accountability in respect of its activities and operations. And if you think about what the motion is asking, if you think about what we're looking at, it's simply saying, would you prefer, or would we prefer as a society, more scrutiny in what is a very important process in our democracy? And you could look at this from a number of angles. You can look at whether or not our electoral management body should have more responsibility to conduct its affairs, or greater independence. Greater independence does not, I think, is not limited by scrutiny. Scrutiny and additional scrutiny and accountability is not a limit on what the Electoral Commission can do and how they can perform their functions. I think, again, it's not something that we should be offended by as a conversation. And when you look at countries where again, elections preoccupy the minds of citizens, you have to be extra careful in the way in which you handle some of the perceptions around the bodies. And there's a study here that looks at how commissions function in terms of the dissemination of information by their bodies. And the survey notes that countries around the world are looking at their electoral management commissions and their electoral management bodies, especially in light of the contentious, well, not contentious, but highly publicized elections, such as the American elections, etc., the United States elections, and looking at how their systems function to reflect the needs of their citizens. And they are drawing from these practices and saying, okay, let us set baseline standards and international standards for our electoral management bodies. So I think Senator Mark was very forward-thinking in moving this motion, because, or not just forward-thinking, but also very current in looking at elections and what they mean to society and how the electoral management bodies filter in and feed into into our democratic institutions. So I'm going to go back to the Zimbabwe study on the qualification criteria for persons located within election management bodies. And they include things as far as, well, minimum age, citizenship, professional qualifications, renowned competence, etc. And they noted as well that the process of appointed members are also stipulated under the country's electoral law, and the recruitment and selection from nomination procedures or open advertising may also be a space that we can critique and look at whether or not we in Trinidad and Tobago are comfortable. So as Minister Rambarak noted, the appointment was from the Public Service Commission, and that Senator Mark was seeking to undermine an independence commission. And I think that's unfair, because a critique of how a system takes place or how it plays out is not, the goal may not be to undermine, but it may be to strengthen and to ensure that we are getting the kind of service that we want as a society, or the kind of results that we want as a society. And so I raise these studies to show that internationally, people are looking very carefully at who comprises their electoral commission or electoral management bodies. This is not something that is strange or personal or an attack. It is just part of maturing as a democracy and growing as a nation. And that is very much the role of our parliament, and it is part of our responsibility here as we sit here. Every time we meet, we are trying to, I believe, put our best foot forward for the nation and create, similarly when we debated the parliamentary autonomy, and we looked very carefully at, is the system working the way that we would like for it to work? Is it doing what we hope for, what we want our parliament to do? So it's the same, it is in that same vein that you can look at an institution like the Electoral Boundaries Commission and say, is it functioning in the way that we would like for it to function? And can we think of ways, like the way that Senator Mark suggested, which is by allowing parliamentary scrutiny of its administration and the manner and exercise of its powers and the methods of functioning and criteria adopted by the Commission, are these things that would assist in the furthering of our democracy? And I would like to agree that it would help, because the more that persons can feel confident in our process, the better it is for society as a whole. In practice, countries have the right to implement and run the elections according to their own standards, their own aspirations, their own goals as a nation. And the right to political participation and the use of the right to political participation and citizens participating within our process will only be fulfilled at its maximum potential, where there's confidence in the process and where persons feel like when they go out to exercise their civic duty, that it means something and that it has an impact, their desired impact. And when you look at the different approaches with the composition and structure of election commission, there's no single body that will ensure an effective and efficient electoral process. There's a diversity internationally, despite the fact that there's a common purpose. And the goals of election commissions are all very common, and the goals are the same, but how you arrive there may be different. And so, do we as a country think that in arriving at our very laudable goal as a mature democracy, wish to locate our Elections and Boundaries Commission under parliamentary scrutiny? There's a lot of merit, I think, in having a joint select committee or some such function look at the EBC and their roles and functions. Because as we have seen technology grow and expand, you find more and more people are paying attention and more people are tuning in. And so if we can shine even more light on the systems by bringing bodies into the public space and into a space for public scrutiny, we would be, in essence, creating more involvement in the process, and people become more connected to the process. And I think that is where we should want to be going as a nation. We should want to have our citizens more engaged in the systems, and if we can do that by shining more light, by putting more scrutiny in place, I think that's something that that is a role, a space that we would want to go towards. Madam President, I'm just trying to, as I was going through this election commissions and provision of information, a comparative study of better practices globally, which was a document produced by the Center for Law and Democracy, the Asian Foundation, and under the auspices of Australian Aid, in September 2000, published in September 2012. The study focused quite heavily on not just the role of election commissions, but also the impact that election commissions have on the confidence that citizens have in their electoral process. And if I can just find my notes here. Yes. So when looking at the election commissions, they took a quotation from a United States judge that says, shining a little light is better than applying disinfectant. Mm-hmm. I believe that was the quote. In speaking, and the context was saying that, look, where you can have increased transparency and accountability and increased scrutiny, then it is better than a reactive approach, or to after something has happened, to say, well, we now have to cure this, or we have to fix this, because by that time, the process is already tainted and persons have already lost confidence. And so what Senator Mark is doing with his motion is ensuring that our citizens will always have confidence in the process and would always be able to say, yes, when I participated in the election, my vote counted for something. It counted, and even if the side that you chose to support did not ultimately become successful, then you still do not feel robbed by the system, or you do not feel as if you have, that you've been disenfranchised as a citizen. And that is extremely important when you think about how nations have been moving forward, because you've been seeing more and more that whether or not an election was billed as free and fair, persons still felt that the way the process unfolded, that their vote did not count, and that it was not, that they were not getting the opportunity to have their say. And that's why you're seeing, calls for...
Senator Haynes, you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you. Where you are seeing calls for a revision of things like the Electoral College in the United States, because they are thinking about whether or not the way the system is set up as it stands is reflective of what they hope to see as a democracy. And Madam President, in the closing few minutes, I would just like to say that what I have seen since I have been here for this short time in the Senate is a space where we may not always have conversations that the citizens feel involved in or feel that there's a need to actively engage in the debate. But when you talk about elections and election commissions and whether or not there's transparency and accountability, that resonates with the population, because they do not want to feel, as Senator Mark noted, disenfranchised. You want to know that the country that you live in, at the very least, if you don't get anything else right, you can get elections correct, because that is where persons have their say. That is ultimately where they can show their dissatisfaction or satisfaction with all of us. And so they want that space to be sacred. They want to also be able to look at how the sausage is made, quite frankly, and know that in this process that that everything about it ran in the manner it is supposed to. So, having said that, Madam President, I would like to fully agree with the motion that Senator Mark brought here today, that there should be no institution that is shrouded from the population, that we as a parliament should stand for scrutiny, should stand for openness, should stand for transparency. Those are things that if we can adopt as part of our everyday being, I think we as a nation can go forward and reach where we would like to be as Trinidad and Tobago. I thank you.
Senator Simonet.
Madam President, I thank you for permission granted to me to contribute to the motion being moved by Senator Mark in this, my maiden speech to this honorable House. For reasons which I shall develop, I must fundamentally oppose the motion in its entirety. The members of this honorable Senate are entrusted to assist in the execution of good governance of the nation, which includes upholding of our Constitution and the rule of law. The citizen is entitled to insist that in executing this duty, we, the members of this Senate, adhere to the very Constitution and rule of law that we require the ordinary citizen to comply with. In listening to the contributions on the other side, the citizenry could be misguided in holding the view that there is little regulation to the manner in which our general elections are held, administered, and indeed reviewed. It is important to appreciate that our 1976 Constitution remains the supreme law of our nation in this regard. And it is important to repeat two preambles to the Constitution as they affect, in my view, a correct rejection of the motion under debate. The preambles in question are Preamble C, which reads, "Whereas the people of Trinidad and Tobago have asserted their belief in a democratic society in which all persons may, to the extent of their capacity, play some part in the institutions of the national life, and thus develop and maintain due respect for lawfully constituted authority." And D, which states, "Whereas the people of Trinidad and Tobago recognize that men and institutions remain free only when freedom is founded upon respect for the moral and spiritual values and the rule of law." In the context of the rule of law, Madam President, it is important to appreciate how the Election and Boundaries Commission is established. And whilst the motion correctly refers to the particular sections of the Constitution, it is important to note with specificity what is provided. In this regard, it is important to note that Section 71 of the Constitution stipulates that, and I quote, "There shall be an Elections and Boundaries Commission for Trinidad and Tobago, in this part referred to as the Commission. The members of the Commission shall be a chairman and not less than 2 nor more than 4 other members." And very importantly, the chairman and other members of the Commission shall be appointed by the President after consultation with the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. So that there can be no doubt that the constitution of the Commission is reached after proper consultation between the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. And no doubt this provision is intended to ensure that persons of good character and persons of some degree of skill and competence are put forward as nominees for appointment by the President. So that I must take exception to the impression given that there is some degree of laxity in the constitution of members of the EBC. The appointment of a commission is after a process of mature consultation between the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, with the appointment being placed ultimately in the discretion of the President. So that I must take a different view to that of Senator Haynes, who conveys the impression that by reference to the requirement in other jurisdictions, and indeed jurisdictions less mature than Trinidad and Tobago, there is some laxity or paucity of review in the appointment process of commissioners of such an important commission as the EBC. And Madam President, I think it is also important to indicate that we often take for granted the doctrine known as the separation of powers, enshrined in our system of government. That is, the development of rules of good governance originating in the Great Charter of the Liberties, known as Magna Carta, Libertatum, agreed by King John and the lords of the English barons at Runnymede, near Windsor in England, in 15th June 1215, constituting fundamental guarantees of rights and privileges. Again, if one were to listen to the contribution made by my friends Senator Mark and Haynes, as opposed to the contribution by my friend Senator Roach, the impression is given that there is some immaturity to the arrangements of our governance going back to at least 1962. The fundamental rule remains that no man, or dare I say woman, shall be above the law, be he or she Prime Minister, Minister, Senator, public servant, or trade unionist. In relation to ensuring good governance and individual liberty, governmental functions are, as we appreciate, divided into three classes. The legislature, comprising the House of Representatives and the Senate, the executive, comprising the cabinet and at times the president, and the judiciary. The founding fathers of our Republican Constitution, the 1976 Constitution, in recognition of the importance of the administration of general elections and related matters, recommended what has come to be known as the Independent and Impartial Elections and Boundaries Commission. It is worthy of note that those founding fathers were men and women of distinguished intellect, capacity, and experience. The EBC is established, as I indicated, by Section 71 of the Constitution, and it is important to appreciate, as we have, how it comes to be constituted. When one considers those disqualified from membership created by Section 71(4), that is, being persons who are either ministers, parliamentary secretaries, members of the House of Representatives, senators or temporary senators, or public officers, it becomes clear that those eligible for appointment to the Commission are persons who have no personal interest in the business of the EBC, that is, the administration and delivery of free and fair elections. The Constitution also provides for security of tenure of the commissioners who hold their office for a term of 5 years from the date of appointment. And very importantly, they do so without receiving a salary. But that is not the only legislative provision for the administration of free and fair elections. As Senator Ambrat pointed out, we have the benefit of the Representation of the People's Act, together with the election rules. Now, when we talk of the separation of powers, we appreciate and have long appreciated in Trinidad and Tobago that the courts of Trinidad and Tobago are the guardians of the Constitution, which creates, in this instance under debate, the Elections and Boundaries Commission. The courts of Trinidad and Tobago are also charged with upholding the rule of law. My friend Senator Ambrat was correct in seeking to identify in the motion moved the mischief that it was seeking to address. Indeed, if one has to discuss any mischief in the election arrangements that govern this country's affairs, one would have to look to the manner in which elections can be questioned. The motion does not address the manner in which elections are questioned. It does not raise that issue frontally. But indeed, that is the issue that lies at the heart of any review of the instant arrangements as administered by the EBC, pursuant to all relevant law, namely the Representation of the People's Act and the election rules. In my humble view, I think that well-settled arrangements for questioning elections and questioning any irregularities in elections adequately provide for the public scrutiny and the protection of the public interest in free and fair elections and in the sanctity of the right to vote. These settled principles and procedures in relation to the questioning by citizens of election irregularity, if one can term it that, are contained in the relevant rules which entitle any citizen to prosecute what has come to be called a representation petition, or if one harkens back to the earlier period, an election petition. These settled principles with respect require no further legislative interference, and they have been well tested by both the opposition and the government, and in this regard, both opposition parties at the time and incumbent government at the time, in the courts, in several representation cases that have reached as far as our Court of Appeal. So that the impartiality and independence of the EBC is established by the constitutional provisions for its appointment of commissioners. And the representation of the People's Act by Section 35 requires all elections to be conducted in accordance with the election rules. It is important to note that Section 35 stipulates, and I read, it provides that no election, at Section 35(3), no election shall be declared invalid by reason of any act by a returning officer or any other person in breach of his official duty in connection with the election or otherwise, or of the election rules, if it appears to the court, having cognizance of the question, that the act did not materially affect the result of the election. Again, the Representation of the People's Act at Section 149 empowers the court hearing a representation petition to declare an election void where it is shown that the commission of a corrupt or illegal practice may be reasonably supposed to have affected the result of the election. And that issue was fully ventilated following the last election, where, without question, the challengers, being the UNC candidates in 6 constituencies, were afforded full opportunity to ventilate their objection to certain arrangements made, as we well know, regarding deployment of administration of the general election by the EBC in September of 2015. But in addition to the written constitutional remedy, that is, the remedy provided by Section 52 of the Constitution, and Section 52, it is important to note, is the provision that provides, the constitutional provision that indicates that any question whether any person has been validly appointed as a senator or validly elected as a member of the House of Representatives shall be determined by the High Court. In addition to the constitutional remedy provided by Section 52 of the Constitution, the common laws received from England prior to independence also applies. And it's important to note that the common law entitles the citizen to promote that a parliamentary election be avoided on an election or representation petition on the ground of irregularity by election officials, if the irregularities were so great as to prevent the election being a true election. And of course, you have the several offenses, that is, election offenses, sounding in the criminal penalty arena, indicated by my learned colleague, Senator Rambarat. So that when one talks of scrutiny of the EBC or scrutiny of the performance by the EBC of its solemn function and obligation, our Court of Appeal correctly recognizes that there are two streams.
Senator Simonet. Honourable Senators, at this stage we will suspend and return at 5 p.m. This sitting is suspended until 5 p.m.